Hello everybody. In this lecture we're going to talk about chapters 3 and 4, globalization, and then foundations for social inequality. First, let's talk a little bit about our past and about globalization in regards to hegemony. So over the last 400 years there have been three dominant countries: Holland, Great Britain, and the US. You heard me say the word hegemony. Well, they established hegemony, which is a situation in which one nation has sufficient power and influence to impose its rules and goals globally in the economic, political, military, diplomatic, and even cultural realms. So Holland started their rule of hegemony from 1620 to 1617. Great Britain then led from 1815 to 73, and the United States then led from 1945 to 1967. And while now, at the height of the U.S. of the hegemonic power has passed, we are still very much a hegemonic nation in regards to military and as well as other factors. So moving on from hegemony and really diving into globalization, let's take a look at the modern world system. So the modern world system, as you can see by the picture below, is a capitalist global economy which contains multiple states and a single dominant international division of labor. Now, you can't just have one dominant international division of labor. So the world system actually broke those down into three different types. So there's three types of countries. There's the core nations, which are countries which possess a successful industrial history, exerts both political and economic influence, and the people of these core nations really enjoy a higher standard of living. A lot of these countries include Western European countries, the United States, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, a few things to note is that the majority of the world's affluent citizens, about 10% of them, live in the core nations. 85% have global wealth, and they reside in the core nations. And Western Europe has 29% of that total. The United States has 25%, and Japan has 20%. So these are kind of some of your big heavy hitters. That's why they're called the core nations. Now, then you can see in the middle you have the semi-peripheral. So these are the nations that are independent states which have achieved a moderate level of industrialization and development. So these include South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and within Latin America you have Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. So then after that you have the peripheral nations. So most of these members are the poorest, least powerful, and least industrially developed set of countries. So these include many different countries within Africa, Asia, and still some in Latin America. So as you can see, Wallerstein's world system theory model works together, where the peripheral nations provide cheap labor and raw materials, while the core nations then gain a high profit from the consumption of these goods. And the peripheral countries also help the semi-peripheral, so not just those core nations. We need to remember that across time, income inequality between the core and peripheral countries has widened, so it's gotten quite a bit bigger, and it's abundantly clear that in contemporary times most workers in the peripheral nations have been increasingly losing out compared to their core nation counterparts. So just because these look like, circles of the same size, please do not mistake that in thinking that they are similar in their size. The diagram is just there to show you the differences between the three types of countries. And with that, you then gain information about the multinational. So multinational is a large corporation which both produces and sells goods or services in various countries. So multinationals came about where before core nations could get, their labor and materials from the peripheral nations. But once the large corporations, the multinational corporations came about, they were able to not only produce and sell goods or services in various countries, they didn't really need as much help from some of the semi-peripheral and peripheral countries. So let's take a look even further into the conditions within the development of the world systems. So and see that as the systems develop, there was expansion in agricultural and industry, commerce and finance. Then there was a formation of an ideology that emphasized free trade, and we'll talk about free trade a little bit later. Third, there was a growth in military to ensure a stable setting to do business. And lastly, there was the demise of the hegemonic power and a restructuring of the system. So that's why Holland, Great Britain, and the U.S., they didn't hold their hegemonic rules for very long because there was a restructuring of the system. So let's go ahead and hop to page 6. And there's an argument against multinational corporations invading poorer countries to use their resources. This argument still occurs today. And it's important to recognize that a given country's economic development emerges gradually over time. So there is still the constant argument in modern times that, the core nations are just going over and just destroying these peripheral nations. Well, a country's economic development emerges over time. It doesn't just happen overnight. While modern multinationals exploit many very poor countries and continue to contribute to their persistent poverty, those countries which were once colonies have usually experienced a lengthy, destructive relationship with core nations that significantly antedates the multinational era. So that's kind of a long, lengthy way of saying that these countries aren't just coming over into the peripheral countries and changing things overnight. It's happening. It's a very long, lengthy process, a destructive relationship that they've had with the core nations. And so it's not just, they're hopping over there and changing their lives overnight. So that's where, there's also a false opinion on the peripheral nations individuals. So a lot of times people believe that the core nations just go over and take over the peripheral nations individuals because these individuals, are unmotivated or intellectually challenged. But what the truth is these individuals are victims, and they're deprived of effective schooling and decent paying jobs, and a lot of times they're very poor. And so it's not that they're unmotivated or not intellectual, but they just don't have the resources available, or the core nations are coming over and taking those resources and services and goods from the peripheral nations, from those people that live there. So an example of this occurred in our own country. The U.S. government helped to deprive Native Americans of their land and their traditional way of life and exploited them and transformed them into the poorest, least educated, and unhealthiest racial group in the country. Now you see I've listed a book here, Indigenous Americans, Third Space of Sovereignty, The Post-Colonial Politics of U.S. Indigenous Relations by Kevin Brulney. Now, this was recommended to me. I have not read the full text yet, but I have read bits and pieces of it, and I highly recommend if you want more information about the Native Americans and the U.S. It's a good read that was recommended to me by someone who is of Native American descent. So on page 56, we start to go through the 3 different types of nations and their class structure, because what's very important to them is their class structure. So let's look at a core nation's class structure. The class structure tends to be fairly consistent from country to country for each core nation. So at the top, they have the capitalist class. These are the leaders of the nations, the multinational companies, and they share a disproportionate share of the wealth. So you can see we have this picture over here of the gentleman who just kind of has his arms wrapped around the factory and is in control of those people. That's more of the leader of the nation's multinational companies. Secondly, you have the professional management or the upper middle class. These folks are well educated, generally have advanced degrees, and are generally paid well. And I showed them by the example on the right. This could include male or female. I don't want to say CEOs because the label of CEO is usually put with the capitalist class, so please don't assume these people are CEOs, but maybe in some of the hierarchy steps below a CEO. Then you have the lower middle class. And a lot of times these are small business owners, clerks, and salespeople. They have enough schooling to qualify for these jobs and enough income to keep a savings account open and modest. So you have a young girl here who's running her own shop. She's a small business owner, a great example of a coronation's low middle class. Then you have the working class. This includes skilled and unskilled job holders. These members have limited formal education and considerable variation in job complexity and income. These can include carpenters, plumbers, electricians, and welders who are much more skilled and better paid than assembly line workers or custodians. And then lastly, you have the poor class. They have the least schooling and fairly few job skills. Some are permanently unemployed for whatever reason, and some work full-time but receive a very low wage. So that's the class structure for the coronations. And before we go to the other class structures, it's important to recognize, especially in this class in regards to social inequality, that not just class is an issue, but also gender can play a significant role. And it can play a significant role on a person's occupation, just like a person's class does. So the text talks about that it was found in 1995 that Walmart was paying their U.S. female workers 19% less than their male counterparts. So this is still an issue. It was in 1995. It still is now for women who work other places than just Walmart, where there is a gender pay gap that is still an issue. But as you can see on the right hand side, I found some great pictures from actual protests from that point in time, people who have protested Walmart in the way that they treat their women. So you can see some of the signs say, the women of Walmart are not worthless. Stop discounting the women of Walmart. Walmart is anti-woman. So I love that the text put that in there. It's important to realize that even though we're talking a lot about class, that gender can also have a large influence. Next, we're going to look at the semi-peripheral and peripheral nations, and they have a fairly uniform set of classes, so a little bit different than the core nations. So first you have the upper class. These include the corporate, industrial, commercial enterprises, the landowners, crop and livestock production, and your top political leaders. Now, the difference for top political leaders is that these folks live and work in the nation's capital, which is not entirely true for a lot of core nations. You then have the upper middle class, which is a small number of well-educated professionals and high-level government officials. Then you have the self-employed lower middle class. So these, similar to core nations, are artisans, shopkeepers, clerks, and small business people. You then have the peasant class, which is different from core nations. This includes people who work with agricultural products, they own or lease their own land. You have the working class, which include industrial, clerical, service job holders, and the temporarily unemployed individuals. And then you have the informal class. So this includes small illegal businesses, the permanently unemployed, and or homeless. So then let's hop over to page 58 where it talks about the top level collusion. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's important to realize that top level collusion is the relationship between a developing nation's political leadership and multinational representatives, and this is where their relationship becomes intimate, mutually serving, and corrupted, paving the way for multinationals to maximize profits, often at the most local citizens' expense. We've had that question happen a lot here in the United States. People have raised the issue of when corporations provide money to a political campaign, when these multinational corporations provide them all this money, Is that causing, is it becoming a mutually self-serving, corruptive, intimate relationship? Is that causing top-level collusion? And it's allowing those multinationals to really maximize their profits. This allows giant companies then to become the only game in town. So I wanted to make note of that because it has occurred in the US and it does throughout the world. So next we're going to look at government involvement, and we realize that when the government becomes involved, it has an impact on several different things. It impacts our technology. It also impacts our educational system. It impacts a sectional share of employment, and then also provides governmental concern for the public welfare. So we're going to fast forward again, not going to spend our time on every piece, but I really wanted to look at something that I thought was interesting, and that's page 68 of the squatter communities. Now, who are squatters? You may have never heard of this term before. So they are individuals or families who settle on land that does not belong to them. So similar but not the same as nomads, if you remember that term maybe from history class or early sociology classes. But squatters are not the same as nomads. These people tend to be poor or very poor, but not all squatters are. So it's very important to realize that. It varies by their income, work, aspirations, and class. So there are 4 conditions that promote squatter communities. These include growing inequality, as well as a surplus population, retrenchment of the welfare state, and then stigmatization. So let's look at each one. So the growing inequality. Brazil eliminated a large number of unskilled jobs and increased positions for university-trained professionals, which made it one of the most economically unequal countries in the world. So this caused people to become squatters, where they had to settle on a land that did not belong to them due to their issues with professional work. With that, the unemployment rate was one of the highest, and since these people lost their job, the majority of workers were poorly paid and were exploited in temporary jobs, often making it difficult or impossible to live anywhere other than a squatter community. The re-entrenchment of the welfare state. So programs that are related to the poor are focused on surveillance and control. Compared to Europe or the United States, Brazil in particular has provided much less support for the poor people in their country. And then you also have a standard of stigmatization. People are looked at differently when they live in a squatter community. It promotes isolation and it diminishes their opportunity to make the contacts necessary to break out of the squatter residency. So stigmatization on the squatter communities really causes a big issue. And looking at the squatter communities, I specifically wanted to look at Khyberia, which the text does a great job providing you good information about a particular squatter community. Now I want to note that the pictures that I do have listed for Khyberia are from Khyberia. So, I didn't just pull these pictures, they're specifically from Khyberia. The local government actually does not recognize Khyberia. It's a squatter community that has no sewers, electricity, or a water supply. They pay as much as 10 times to get water, and water is actually seen as an illegal source of money, and so is housing. Now, don't think that the people of Khyberia are depressed. Many of them are actually proud, hardworking individuals who have struggled to make a decent living. People have talked about that many people will bring out their high school diplomas to show that they are well-educated individuals. So that's why I said before, not all people that live in squatter communities are unintelligent or extremely poor. They're really just struggling to make a decent living. I think a lot of us in the United States at one point or another can understand what those people of Khyberia have gone through. Khyberia residents have varied backgrounds and lifestyles, and Working inside of Khyberia makes them a part of the informal sector, which involves jobs and businesses that the government does not monitor or tax. Since they don't consider them an actual community, then they don't monitor or tax the jobs or businesses that are in Khyberia. And I love that the text talks about the story of Winnie Kiyako. She's a businesswoman in Khyberia who ran an interesting business as a seller of potatoes, and she was also a member of the merry-go-round. So the merry-go-round is something that I thought was quite interesting. She was a part of a 15-person merry-go-round to which each woman, so each of the 15 women, contributed 1,000 shillings every 2 weeks. This is on page 70 if you don't know where I am. Twice a month, someone received the kitty. So it's kind of like when you play Monopoly. You know, if you've ever played Monopoly before, you go around, you can pass go for $200, so you gain $200. But if you hit free parking, you hit the kitty. And so that's kind of similar to what this is, where they put money in, they put in so many shillings, and then twice a month, someone gets the free parking. They get the kitty. At one point, Kiyako had additional expense and lacked the money to buy potatoes. For 6 months, she stopped making her weekly trips for potatoes until the $15,000 shilling payment from the merry-go-round allowed her to get started again. The importance of the merry-go-round is that it emphasizes spending and not saving, and joining one is a practical way of recognizing that at times individuals like Kiyako need extra money for business expenses, old debts, or perhaps a medical bill. The other extremely important thing to know about this merry-go-round is that only women participate in these. Neither women nor men could explain why this was the case. Again, it's important to recognize that squatter community individuals are hardworking, resourceful, and fairly successful individuals. So I added some extra information that wasn't found in your text about Khyberia from the BBC. This is an overview picture of Khyberia. In 2009, the census put that the population was at 170,000, but others estimate it's 800,000. Again, it's not monitored or taxed by the government, so there's no formal census that's completed. It's more than 617 acres. The original settlers were Nubian people from Kenya and Sudanese borders, and they're mostly now from Liao, Kikau, and Lao communities, and 50% of the residents in this squatter community are unemployed.